As we moved out of the Iron Age from around 1000 BC onwards, not only did Greek culture expand internally, but we also begin encountering the rather enigmatic and fascinating Phoenicians. Greek characterizations of the Phoenicians were not always positive, with even Homer describing them throughout the Odyssey as being famed for their ships, but nevertheless greedy and frequently carrying and trading cargo that he deemed of low value, things like trinkets, baubles, or knockoffs. The general perception among the Greeks appears to have been that they were only interested in money or trade and did not have any really moral or ethical basis that the Greeks themselves clearly superiorly had. Unfortunately, while obviously polemical and one-sided, this etic characterization carried over into how 19th and 20th century classical archaeologists approached the study of the Phoenicians. They were generally seen as background or secondary actors in the Mediterranean, usually characterized as maritime traders with a kind of mercantile sea people attitude. Even the name Phoenician itself presents a challenge for us, since it doesn't actually create a clear identity for them. Each of the towns or ports that composed what we now know as the Phoenician world were often very different and self-identified, and as a Greek exonym, the term gives us a bit of a false impression that the Phoenicians were some kind of unified culture when it just isn't the case. Instead, they were a society of independent city-states. The Phoenicians did not have a term to denote the land of Phoenicia as a whole. Instead, demonyms were often derived from the name of the city that individuals or certain goods came from. Generally, when you look at a map of ancient Phoenicia, the colonization is usually said to be for trade or commerce and is found around the southern Mediterranean, in contrast to the Greek colonization, which focused on settlements around the north coast, southern Italy, France, and eventually Spain. In more recent scholarship, there have been efforts to break away from these stereotypes, since we're now seeing that Phoenicians definitely did incorporate settlement foundation into their maritime activity, primarily around Carthage and modern-day Tunisia. And on the other side, the Greeks themselves were also definitely engaging in maritime trade and commerce using techniques and trade routes that were traditionally ascribed to the Phoenicians. At places like Sardinia and Sicily, we even see Greek and Phoenician influence mixing in local varieties, which is increasingly becoming the norm over the exception for other settlements across the Aegean. What used to be heavily defined regionalism and cultural specific processes are increasingly now being seen as much more mixed and blended with each other. Now, the Phoenicians as a collective people make up the Levantine city-states following the collapse of the Canaanite late Bronze Age state system. Since very little has survived of their own records or literature, most of what is known about their origins and history came from accounts of other civilizations and influences from their material culture. The current consensus is that the Phoenician period of prominence was from around 1200 BC up until the end of the Persian period around 332 BC. While there are numerous debates over exactly which cultures constituted the Phoenicians, and whether they were a direct successor to the Canaanite Bronze Age cultures or a different, distinct Semitic people, it's mostly agreed that, in the very least, the general geographical area of Canaan became Phoenicia following the period of the Sea People invasion. They seem to have weathered the Bronze Age collapse pretty well, and seem to then have emerged as an organised group following this crisis and filled the power vacuum in the Levant, helping to revive the Mediterranean economy by re-establishing, or in the very least playing a pivotal role in that re-establishment of long-distance trade between Egypt and Mesopotamia during the 10th century BC. One of the things that makes them so mysterious, though, is that the early Phoenician Bronze Age is, for the most part, largely unknown to us. The two most important sites clearly were Byblos and Sidon Tyre, and as of 2021, over 100 sites in the Phoenician world still haven't been excavated, while some others still haven't been fully analysed. From what we can tell, in the early Phoenician period, from around 1200 to 950 BC, the city of Sidon in modern-day Lebanon was preeminent until it was eventually supplanted by the city of Tyre. During the 9th century, the Assyrian Empire began to expand and bring Sidon, Tyre and Byblos under control, extracting resources from them, which naturally motivated the inhabitants to spread further out into the Mediterranean in search of resources to support the tributes. Recent excavations, however, have shown that Phoenician cities were already pretty prosperous and powerful during the 10th century, a century before Assyrian influence, and their influence appears to have extended as far as colonies in Cyprus and Sardinia, and even in the Balearic Islands and Sicily, and maybe even as far as Malta, that were eventually weakened by the Assyrian arrival. By the mid-8th century BC, the Phoenicians were more heavily dominated by the Assyrians, which appears to have resulted in the emancipation of their Cyprianic colonies, leading to quite a few revolts and riots that were seemingly crushed by Assyrian forces. This whole movement led to a decrease in Phoenician political autonomy and freedom of trade. Around 612 BC, the Assyrian Empire was overthrown by the Medes in Persia, which allowed Phoenicia to regain its independence temporarily until the Babylonian uprising in Egypt, which led to them being conquered again. The Levant was brought under Persian hegemony towards the end of the 6th century and experienced a new period of political and economic expansion that coincided with Sidon once again becoming the preeminent city-state. Finally, during the 4th century, as the Persian Empire disintegrated, by around 333 BC, the region was subsumed in the Macedonian conquests of Alexander. On the whole, it would probably be best for us to break away from the historical, emically Greek perception of the Phoenicians as an Oriental culture that was somehow other or exotic to them. Instead, with the level of mixing and cultural exchange, it's much better to understand the Phoenicians as a maritime culture of their own, who often act as custodians or cultural syncretics, who were instrumental in spreading numerous cultural ideas across the Mediterranean. They created much more than simple trade hubs or market towns. Extensive settlements like Carthage, Malaga, and Cadiz have a pronounced Phoenician character and flavour, and even a background. Like the Greeks and their characteristic polis structure, the Phoenicians also seem to have had a fairly characteristic way of building cities and selecting locations for their primary centres. On the whole, in-between places, such as islands or crossing areas like peninsulas, seem to have been very popular locations for them, and we see this in places like Cadiz and Tharros. A large part of their motivation for these areas appears to have been a desire to not interfere with local populations too drastically, as well as having good access to harbour and mineral resources, signalling a clear strategic planning aspect to the foundation of their cities. As time goes on, what began as small colonies on coasts, usually on the peripheries of locations, began to expand into major centres that then began to influence indigenous cultures around them, in terms of architecture and art, wherever the Phoenicians landed. Undoubtedly, the Phoenicians had a drastic influence on the Greeks, even if they didn't want to actually admit it. There's been a huge debate in the last 20 years over such Oriental influences among the Greeks and how central they are to understanding the development of Greek identity and culture as a whole. Among the more controversial takes, we find modern examples like the Black Athena hypothesis, published in 1987 by Bernal, in which he argued that much of Greek civilization was indebted to Egypt and Pan-African cultures. More measured arguments have continuously been put forward on the stylistic origin of Greek art and the question of whether such debates are relevant at truly addressing the surface cultural veneer of what was effectively a very multicultural society. In 2020, James Whitley published his research on the presence and influence of Near Eastern art in the Iron Age Mediterranean, in which he examined 3 different types of foreign materials that were found in Greece, notably Phoenician bronze used for bowl making, Nimrud ivories, and Griffin protomes. His work showed that the numbers of foreign imports of material increased quite dramatically during the 7th and 8th centuries BC, and that different regions of Greece engaged differently with these materials, probably with traders coming from the eastern Mediterranean. The ivories from Nimrud, for example, appear to have been much more popular around the Aegean caves on Crete, but there doesn't seem to have been much interest around them in Athens or on the mainland. The Griffin potamos, on the other hand, were extremely popular around Samos and the sanctuary Olympia, but not really anywhere else. Contrary to popular belief derived from Homer, then, around the same time that the Greeks are getting more and more cemented in their own identity of Panhellenism and laying the foundations for the polis system between the 8th and 7th centuries, we also find a statistical increase in Oriental contact that manifests as an increasing number of imported foreign ware from Eastern cultures. The clearest example of this is in early Greek sculpture, with the kudos figurines clearly being modelled off of Egyptian sculptural and artistic conventions and proportions, which was over 3,000 years old before the Greeks even really arrived. While in the space of decades following the earliest kudos sculptures, the conventions of classical art were laid, behind it all is 3,000 years of Egyptian innovation. While the Greeks may have taken inspiration from Egypt, though, their use and display of sculpture was completely different and characteristically Greek. I'd be remiss, of course, to not even mention the Greek alphabet. It's well known that the reinvention of the alphabet post-Mycenaean Linear B was based on Phoenician script that was ultimately derived from Egyptian hieroglyphs. The full extent of this change, however, is oftentimes seldom grasped by people. You can't just copy another culture's alphabet. A script's adoption also requires adopting an entire new way of thinking, whether it's in how the letters are written or how the language relates to the script, which naturally requires a very high degree of cultural interchange and exchange. There are a few sites throughout the Mediterranean that really emphasize this cultural exchange in action. One of the more sobering examples comes to us from the northern Levantine site of Almina. This site was first excavated in the 1930s, and a large amount of Greek cultural material was found here, mainly in the form of pottery. Initially hypothesized by the excavators to be a Greek colony, this has since been called into question on the basis that there is no clear definition around how exactly we can categorize the characteristics of a colony. While there is certainly a large portion of Greek-influenced pottery, when examined in context with the rest of the assemblages found at the site, the quantity is actually much less compared to other local types and styles. The vast majority of the ceramics from Almina are actually of northern Levantine style, which is local and indigenous, which of course raises the question around how exactly we really identify the site. Are we really looking at a colony here, or is it perhaps more of a port with a connection to Greece? Equally important is the fact that the Almina ware, which imitates Greek skipoi, never appears in Cypriot context together with original Greek imports. Since access to Greek imports was confined to the elite, as shown by Clelard, the Almina ware should be understood as a local substitute, not necessarily a Greek import. It was likely produced by non-elite milieus, for locals who probably didn't have access to Greek imports. The fact that it was exported to Almina in large numbers, where the amount of Greek imports was generally higher, just underlies the general character of a relatively cheap commodity. The architecture of the site is also distinctly Levantine, so there's no real evidence that it's the Greeks who are driving the expansion and building of Almina, but it appears to be a much more interesting case of interaction between local cultures and Hellenic ones. So, Who exactly could we hypothesize these inhabitants to be? Who lived here? Are we looking at a small local group of Greeks? Are they indigenous Levantines who are mirroring Euboean pottery styles? Coupled with some recent discoveries like the Tel Dor mosaic, we can make a fairly definitive but I think very important statement. Hellenistic style does not necessarily equate to Greek ethnicity, especially of the patron or the artist. But, importantly, it also doesn't mean that such materials and motifs would have a Greek mode of use. It doesn't mean that just because something is Hellenistic in a certain area, that it will necessarily be read in a Hellenistic way. It could be understood or used in an entirely different cultural context, and this is a testament to the multiculturality of ancient Greece. So with that, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next week.